It's a great song, Revelation song. Awesome. We should sing that a lot. Back in St. Clair Shores, Michigan, I was in my first ministry. I was in a setting where the pastor and the associate pastor, it was a church of about 400 people. The pastor and the associate pastor had both resigned within a couple of months of one another. There was just some difference in philosophy of ministry they had that had been building for some time, and they just couldn't seem to get it resolved. And I was hired kind of at the tail end of that, right fresh out of college. I just graduated from my master's program, and I was ready for ministry. I'd been looking for ministry for a while, and I was ready for it. And I knew both of these pastors very, very well. I had active ministry alongside both of them for several years, in fact, because I was actually a member of that church. While I'd been going to school, I was there. I'd been there longer than them. I was there when they were hired. So when I came into this position, I had some mixed feelings. I was nervous coming into a conflict like that. I mean, people were leaving. We lost about 150 people in about a 6-month span. I mean, pastors just have followings, and that's what happens. I was young. I was also exhilarated at the opportunity. But I also felt overwhelmed at what faced me. I felt alone. I wasn't really alone. I just felt like I was alone. Yet at the same time, I felt confident. I had some great weeks where I thought absolutely powerful things had happened, and I had some really bad weeks where I just felt like there was just demon oppression. And in one of those particularly bad weeks of nervousness and confusion, into my office walks an elderly gentleman by the name of John Wybinga. Now, John was someone that I knew fairly well because I knew most of the people fairly well there. I mean, I had ministered there for quite some time. And John was a truly good man. This was someone who loved God. He served him faithfully. He was a respected person of quality. He was also a retired school teacher, and that kind of becomes important in the story here because John was the kind of guy who never really had any visible soft side to him. Now, I don't think that's because of being a school teacher. It's just, can you imagine if you were a student, and I would hear students say that about John. But everybody kind of knew this about him. As long as I knew John, I never saw him smile. I never heard him laugh. I'm sure he did smile and laugh somewhere in his life. It's just that I never saw it. He was just always a serious kind of guy. So he comes in, and he wants to talk to me about a letter, an informational letter that I had sent out. It was about a page and a half long. I sent it out about, a week and a half earlier, about some ministry of real importance that the church was involved in because we'd been going through a lot of heartache and stuff, so this was something that was supposed to help us to be able to minister to others while causing us to kind of grow together. He walks in, and he has a suit coat on. He doesn't have a tie on, but he typically does, but he doesn't. He has a suit coat on. He has a nice shirt and nice pants on, which seems to have always been his attire. John just was not a casual kind of person, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But he comes in, and he has a copy of my letter. Now, he's got kind of like this teacher's folder, and on top of it, he's holding my letter. So as we're kind of like breaking the ice and just chit-chatting for a second, I couldn't help but to notice. I kept looking down at his hand where he was holding his folder and my letter had all of these red markings all over it. I mean, things were in red, words were underlined, and other things were circled, and he had these squiggly lines on there that I couldn't tell what those had to do with. And obviously, he's unhappy with my letter. And he proceeds for the next 15 minutes or so to point out to me all of the errors, the typos. Now, that was a day and age when most of the stuff that you had done as a pastor, you gave to your secretary to type. And now, it's completely reversed now. But he comes in and he wants to talk to me about the typos and what he thought were missed punctuations or unnecessary punctuations and wordy sentences and weak transitions. Well, I'm sitting there, so after about 15 minutes of me being talked to, I'm starting to get a little bit irritated. But I didn't show it. I didn't show it because I realized that he was reading this as a school teacher who had just kind of received some assignments from his students. I didn't argue any of his points, but I did ask him what he felt about the purpose and the content of the ministry that was being promoted in this letter. And he honestly told me that he hadn't really thought it through yet. Now, I did not in any way, once John left, I got the letter out again. I had to make sure I looked at it and stuff. I did not in any way think that my letter was done as poorly as he indicated. Yes, absolutely, there were a couple of details that I would change the next time I would do something like this, because as I was sitting there listening to him, I was thinking to myself, my goodness gracious, I've written 50-page papers for classes that didn't have as many corrections on it as this one letter. I mean, John, come on. I'm not saying this, I'm thinking this to myself. I mean, John, come on. I'm not writing a dissertation here. And I admit that. My only concern in the letter were just the essentials of the ministry that was before us. The letter was good. It conveyed fully what we were entering into. Its perfection in communication was not a top priority for me. And I was frustrated. I was frustrated at that, not at his petulance of what he thought was an inferior letter, but at his resistance to see the essentials of the letter, to see the essentials of the ministry that we were going to be a part of. There was so much more at work here that he just didn't see. Even when I made some attempt to point it out to him, I emphasized the essentials to him, but he just hadn't noticed. At the end of John chapter 3, we find that Jesus and his disciples have now left Jerusalem. After a thrilling and challenging display of his teaching and power to those at the temple during Passover, which we looked at in John chapter 2, and then following a lengthy but very intense discussion with Nicodemus about the merits of new life, Jesus leaves the city. And he and his followers are going to head for northeast Judea, and they're going to spend a long time there. They're going to stay there for about 8 months. But while they're there, a frivolous dispute is going to rise, and it's going to arise over some non-essentials. This dispute's going to arise over the value of baptism and purification. Their version of John Waibenga is unfolding before them. Well, as we close out chapter 3 here, we're going to uncover what I hope is a couple of further tactics that will help us to avoid the unnecessary red arrows of the inessentials that can derail serious essential ministry that we might have in the life of another human being. Because most of the time we have to admit to ourselves as we just kind of move about through life, most of the time having all of my I's dotted and my T's crossed is not something that I really worry about. Most of the time that's just a distraction more than it is a help. Yes, I fully agreed with John in principle. In principle, I thought he was right. I absolutely want to be able to make my case for Christ. Now, this would be true. This principle would be true for anything that we do in life, especially as believers. But because we're talking about ministry, I absolutely want to be able to make my case for Christ as clear as possible to a genuine seeker and listener, but not over the petulance of the inessentials. What we're going to do is we're going to read John chapter 3 from verse 22 down through verse 36 as we close out this chapter. We want to do this just to kind of see where the story is going. Why does John even include these events here as we find at the end of this chapter? So just follow along. It'll be up on the screen, and I'll read through this quickly. Verse 22, after these things, Jesus and his disciples came into the land of Judea, and there he was spending time with them, and he was baptizing. But John also was baptizing in Enon near Salim, because there was much water there, and people were coming and were being baptized. Now, I find that kind of curious because verse 23 completely removes any of the spiritual nature of why John was baptizing where he was. There was a spiritual nature to his baptizing, but it's like John kind of says, hey, I got this ministry of baptizing. Where should we do it? And someone says, oh, hey, there's a lot of water over there. Okay, let's do that. I think that's kind of neat. And it gives us a little bit of a historical detail in verse 24, for John had not yet been thrown into prison, meaning eventually he gets thrown into prison and he's killed for it. But right now he's still actively ministering. Verse 25. Therefore, there arose a discussion on the part of John's disciples with a Jew about purification. And so they, meaning John's disciples, they come to John and they said to him, Rabbi, he who was with you beyond the Jordan, to whom you have testified, behold, he is baptizing and all are coming to him. So this discussion of purification comes up, but it leads his disciples to go ask John about a different question of Jesus baptizing. Verse 27. John answered and said to him, "A man can receive nothing unless it has been given to him from heaven. You yourselves are my witnesses that I said," there was a time in the past that I said, "I am not the Christ, but I have been sent ahead of him. He who has the bride is the bridegroom, but the friend of the bridegroom, who stands and hears him, rejoices greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. So this joy of mine has been made full." I'm comfortable with where I'm at in my ministry life. Verse 30, "He must increase, but I must decrease. He who comes from above is above all. He who is of the earth is from the earth and speaks of the earth. He who comes from heaven is above all." Now that is John's restatement, pretty much, of what Jesus said about himself back in verse 13. That I didn't ascend into heaven, I descended from heaven. God didn't take me up into heaven to teach me a bunch of things. I came down from heaven because I'm already God. Verse 32. "What he has seen and heard, of that he testifies, and no one receives his testimony," meaning there's not a big response to it so far. Verse 33, "He who has received his testimony, he has set his seal to this, that God is true. For he whom God has sent speaks the words of God. For he gives the Spirit without measure." There's a picture of grace, freedom. "The Father loves the Son and has given all things into his hand. He who believes in the Son has eternal life, but he who does not obey the Son will not see life, and the wrath of God abides on him." Now what we want to do is we want to try to discern several ways, 3 ways in fact, in which we can emphasize the essentials, at least in our initial contacts with people that we want to try and approach with Christ, and somehow to find a way to avoid the lesser issues which can draw us away from the essentials. Talking about the details of life, talking about the details of the spiritual life are fine as long as we don't lose our direction. Details are good, don't lose your direction in it. And the essentials can be seen fully in Jesus' dialogue with Nicodemus. We saw when we looked at that Jesus is the object of our destiny first. Jesus is the object of our faith first. All these other questions and concerns we have in life, thousands of them, they're all important, but will not be settled properly until the object is in place. John the Baptist's disciples become embroiled over one of those many questions, and it becomes petty. It's something that they should have had a better handle on, but they don't. And here's the first thing that we see in this dispute, and that is when the essentials are secure. When the essentials are secure, John, we know, is actively baptizing. This is his calling. That's why he's doing it. It's what defines his primary mission from God. His primary mission is to pave the way before and during the ministry of Christ. Sometimes that's forgotten. We think of John as just paving the way. He did, but he also continued to point to Christ in those first early months, up to almost a year of Christ's ministry, until verse 24, until he's arrested and killed. Look at verse 23. John also was baptizing in Enon near Salim because there was much water there and people were coming to him and were being baptized, for John had not yet been thrown into prison. Therefore there arose a discussion on the part of John's disciples with the Jew about purification, meaning that because John was still active in his ministry, he hadn't died yet, this discussion comes up. This dispute arises. This discussion we find here is with a certain Jew. Now that word Jew there is a little bit obscure in the original language, and I don't want to make a big deal about this, but it's a little bit obscure here because it appears in the singular. And I only want to point it out because probably what's happening here is that this indication of a Jew just means that he is a spokesman for a group. It's probably, most things were done out in the open out there. Most things that happen with these dialogues are crowds of people. This Jew is just probably a spokesperson for a group and probably a lot of religious leaders. But the discussion that arises, that word dispute here, that is a word that doesn't really have the idea of something being antagonistic, meaning an argument where you're just really opposed to somebody. It's really more of the idea of being perplexed, confused. And that's not a bad thing. When you're dealing with someone and you're talking about spiritual things and they're still a little bit confused, that's okay, as long as they are still asking questions. If they want clarity, then you've still got them hooked, and that's a good thing. But unfortunately, that kind of thing can lead to a dispute. And we find here that it is a twofold issue. In verse 25, it's about purification. In verse 26, that becomes a discussion about baptism. Now, these two things, purification and baptism, these are not essentials, but they are important concerns to every good Jew. Throughout the church age, every church of every period has had their own debates, all the way up until our modern church here today. We have all kinds of debates over things that are not essentials, but they can distract us from the weightier biblical concerns. When you are met with one of these non-essentials, it's very difficult to measure the level of sincerity. So there are two tests that can help you to decide this. The first is, what is the level of concern in getting to the truth? And then secondly, what is the level of concern in staying on target? If you can arrive at the truth, that's great. Then the next concern is, can I stay on target? Here the discussion seems to begin with truth clearly in mind. Jesus' disciples, they are out there baptizing, and so are John's disciples. And their concern, isn't that just a repetitive, competitive ministry function here? But it also has a confusing twist because of this discussion here of this Jewish ritual of purification. Now I want you to try to remember that this is something we've come across before. Jesus has dealt with this earlier, remember back in chapter 2 at the wedding of Cana. Jesus used purification pots to turn water into wine. Now this was very, very important. This Jewish tradition of purification was very, very important to the good religious Jew, but it was not something that was a precept of the law. It was a tradition, but it was not demanded by the law. It wasn't a weightier biblical concern, but it just looked that way because over the centuries it took on an essential meaning that it was never meant to have. Going back to that wedding in Cana, if you remember, those pots at the wedding of Cana, they were there so that when people would show up, they'd be traveling for quite some time over dusty roads. They were there so they could wash their hands, they could wash their feet, they could wash anything that was visible. Now that was its practical use, and that makes sense. That would be a good thing to have at a party like this. But it had taken on spiritual overtones that it was never meant to have. It was meant to, it had become kind of like a primer to spiritual cleansing. Anybody ever hear the phrase before? We kind of laugh when we say this, that cleanliness is next to godliness. Anybody ever hear that? Well, that's kind of where this comes from. We laugh at it, but they took it seriously. A person took physical cleansing seriously, not just for its practical physical value, but because it pointed to something more importantly in the spiritual life, a spiritual cleansing. And this is what this discussion would have been regarding John and Jesus' baptism. Were these baptisms also making someone spiritually clean? Now remember, going back to that wedding in Cana again, Jesus used seriously dirty water to make the cleanest, best wine that head waiter had ever tasted. So the essentials here are not necessarily secure. There's deep sincerity on both parties here, but they need to find out the truth to all of this. You know, talking to people about Jesus certainly can get lost at times in non-essentials, especially when those non-essentials have religious overtones. When we get in discussions about, good works, about feeding the poor and helping the homeless and in our morning worship services, what do we do? How do we make it work best? What kind of songs do we sing? Do we sing hymns? Do we only sing contemporary music? How often should we do communion? Where do we stick the announcements in? Should we get up and shake hands? We can get into all these discussions about non-essentials. When I was an older teen, just before I had really recommitted my life to the Lord, I got into a discussion with my Uncle George. He was a good, godly man. He was someone who loved the Lord. He saw the best in everyone. In fact, to the extent where he had a thriving business going at one time, and he just took this guy at his word, and this guy bilked him for $100,000. He lost his business. A long story to all that. So he ended up going back into business by himself, which was basically hanging aluminum siding. And I worked with him for about a year when I was about 18 years old. Now, this is leading up to my rededication to the Lord, but I didn't know all this was happening. I just knew some spiritual things were taking place. And my Uncle George was a great guy, a good, godly guy, but he was also extremely charismatic. And many times when we were in his truck talking, I'd get questions. We would talk about spiritual things, and I loved it, but I'd get questions about spiritual gifts. Have you spoken in tongues? No, I kind of barely knew what that was at that time. No, I've never spoken in tongues. Well, you probably should seek that from the Lord. I'm trying to figure out from him, well, what are you saying? Are you saying that I'm not saved until I speak in tongues? And he couldn't quite bring himself to say that, but it was really important. Have you ever had a quivering lip? I said, I don't even know what that is. Now, that's a real spiritual manifestation in a lot of charismatic churches. Quivering lip, a shaking of the body, that kind of stuff. I go, no, I never really had that. But I was always given the impression that somehow I wasn't spiritually quite there yet. Jesus wasn't just fully in me until I did this. And I came to realize sometime later that this was just a non-essential. It didn't really matter. See, these are not unimportant per se. They are just not essentials when you lose track of Jesus as the target. Staying on target to the truth. And for these disciples of John, they do try to do this, but they have a greater concern about Jesus' dual ministry of baptizing. So what do? They go to their master. They go to John the Baptist to figure this out. Verse 26. And they came to John and they said to him, Rabbi, he who is with you beyond the Jordan, to whom you have testified, behold, he's baptizing. And look at this next statement. This is what they're really concerned about. Everybody is going to him. This is sort of like them saying, hey, look, we're baptizing, he's baptizing, but everybody's going to him. What are we supposed to do now? If everybody's going to go to him, what happens to our ministry? What are we supposed to do now? Well, John has already pointed out to at least some of his disciples earlier, when Jesus was, on the scene in the wilderness, when John was baptizing, he pointed Jesus out to them. That's the guy that you need to follow. And he does this several times here. There's the essential. That's who I want you to focus on. Stick with him. And now he puts it in terms which will keep them on track. Look at verse 30 and 31. He must increase, but I must decrease. He who comes from above is above all. And he who is of the earth is from the earth, and he speaks of the earth. He who comes from heaven is above all. Purification, spiritual gifts, baptism, any kind of good work, communion, music, it's all good. All of that is good when weightier issues come first, when Jesus comes first. The next thing that we want to see in this dispute about the essentials is when the essentials get sidetracked. When they get sidetracked. When I had my friction with my friend John Wybinga about what he thought was the pitiful state of my letter, I had to somehow judge whether I felt that his concern was very sincere or was it just petty. And in order to do that, I came to two conclusions. Now, I didn't come to these conclusions at the time I was talking to him. Again, something else I had to think about afterwards. But I came to two conclusions. The first was, did John have an over-concern about the order? And secondly, did he have an under-concern about the object? We do everything, at least we should, as people, as believers, as a church. We should do everything in order and with composure. But that doesn't mean that everything that we do is equal in importance. The question of importance in this debate here in John 3 is this. If Jesus really can offer spiritual purity once and for all, then should we continue this practice of purification? Look at verse 34. For he whom God has sent speaks the words of God. For he gives the Spirit without measure. This is the promise of God's fullness indwelling every saint. So if that's the case, where does purification fit? Because there's nothing wrong in the practice of it, so long as it just serves as a reminder of what has already been done in perfection. So the practice of it is fine. But you can't lose sight of the fact that the practice of it just points to the perfection. But what happened is this got turned around over the centuries. It was the practice of it that made perfection. No, the practice of purification was just meant to point, like everything else in the law, whether it was ascribed by the law or a tradition of the law, was meant to point to the person of Christ, to that purification. So that means the practice of purification is open to different displays of how we carry it out. Its perfection is found in Christ, but its practice is found in our differing styles, just like everything else we do. Just like when we come to worship, what kind of music? When do we have communion? Some churches like to do communion every week. The brethren like to do that every week. Some want to do it once a month, every 6 weeks, whatever. All of it is just meant to point to something else. My friend, John Wybinga, laid too much stress on the letter as a display of perfection. Now, I don't know if he would have admitted that, but that's what I had to come to understand. In this debate here, the simple response is, if purification is what you're concerned about, that's good, that's fine, nothing wrong with that, but it's only Jesus who makes one pure. That's why the emphasis is always on him. As John says in verse 30, I must decrease, he must increase. The other conclusion I came to was that John had an under-concern about the object. The letter, and I don't think he got this, the letter was just a means to an end. Think about all the other stuff we do in the church, our style of worship, I've mentioned, our music, our announcements. Do you know announcements? I'm bothered by announcements, not in giving them. I always feel awkward. All of my years in pastoral ministry, I never know where to stick them in. I don't know what to do with them. Where do they kind of fit best in a morning worship service? You know, when I ever have a chance to visit other churches or I watch them on TV, that's one of the things I always look for. I always kind of want to know, what does the pastor do about announcements? Where do they stick them in? How do they make it work so that it's worshipful? There are pastors who will get into larger churches that basically go up there and say, we do no public announcements. In a church the size they might be in, there's too much going on, we'll miss something. If you're a part of a ministry, if you're leading a ministry, you need to find out what's going on. We put it up on the screen, we have a bulletin, you need to check with that. Don't make us have to convey to you unless it's some kind of emergency. But however you do those kind of things, the kind of music, should we shake hands with one another, before each service, the baptisms, our outreaches, our Facebook pages. Oh my gosh, have you ever checked churches' Facebook pages? We have a good one, actually. There are a lot of them out there that are not very good. But all of these things, our Wednesday program, whatever programs you do through the week, all of these things are just simply a means to an end. Yes, I agree. I want that means to be clear and orderly. When I come up here, I want this message of mine. I want all of my messages and all of my lessons to be clear and orderly. I work really hard at this, but I do miss things. Trust me, they don't always come out the way that I plan for them. But is the object seen? Is it understood? Is it relevant? My friend John could hardly recall what the letter was about. This is something that John the Baptist kind of had a problem with earlier that we know about already. It wasn't that long ago that his ministry was being mistaken for a self-proclamation of messiahship. Can you imagine? John's out there baptizing, pointing to the person of Christ, and you got religious leaders coming over going, okay, are you the prophet? Are you the one? Are you Messiah? It's like, oh, come on. I thought I was clear here about all this. No, I'm not the one. And it's coming up again. How many times do I have to keep telling you I'm not him? He's the guy, the one over there. And he had to quickly and seriously redirect the crowd's attention back to the real purpose of all of what he was doing, and pointing their way to Christ, who was the true object. And he does it again here. Look at verse 29. And I love this illustration he uses. He who has the bride is the bridegroom. But the friend of the bridegroom, so the bridegroom is Jesus, he's the friend. John is just the friend of the bridegroom, who stands and hears him, rejoices greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. So this joy of mine has been made full. How many different ways do I have to make this clear? I'm the friend of the bridegroom. I love these wedding motifs. They're used a lot in the New Testament because they describe best our relationship to Jesus and his kingdom. This is to be a friend of the bridegroom. John says, yes, it is a relationship of honor, but don't ever confuse it with the importance of the bridegroom himself. The bridegroom, of course, is Christ. It means he is the center of attention. We rejoice at the work and ministry of Christ, but also at being a part of all that he does. I'm so glad that he just pulls me in. That's why John says at the end of verse 29, I'm fully happy with this. The fact that I'm decreasing and he's increasing is perfectly fine with me. So much so that that's how he removes himself from any possible confusion. It's not me. It's not me. I'm just a means to an end. Look at him. Look at him. John knows the confusion of ministry will only have the dampening effect of Jesus being reduced in significance. In fact, that's actually what happens here, at least to some degree. By the time you get to chapter 4 in those first few verses, Jesus decides to leave the area because of this. Look quickly, John 4, look at the first 3 verses. Therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself wasn't baptizing but his disciples, he left Judea. And he went away again into Galilee. This dispute is what leads him to his next singular conversation, this time with a woman, the Samaritan woman at the well. Remember, he had a singular conversation with Nicodemus? Now he has another singular conversation with the woman at the well. And this is what opens up the entirety of his Galilean ministry. This dispute about the inessentials leads Jesus to another powerful ministry. So Jesus determines to leave the area to avoid trouble with the Pharisees who saw John's ministry of baptizing as more to their liking. I don't really quite understand that. We're not really told in the text why they all of a sudden, these Pharisees kind of side with John. But that's what Jesus perceives here. But I want you to understand, he's not running away from ministry. He is redirecting his efforts. And that can be a purposeful tactic when you just cannot resolve a conflict. Some debates just simply aren't reconcilable at the moment. So you don't curl up, go into your house and say, I will never minister again. It's not what you do. You come up with a new plan. Jesus leaves John the Baptist to his ministry, and that's good. And he just takes up another one. The last thing I just want to briefly mention here about the essentials is the danger of them being silenced, when the essentials are silenced. This was the danger here. That's why Jesus left. Let John go about and do his work, and I'll just go somewhere else and do something else. John the Baptist, he wasn't silencing anyone. His ministry was full and it was rich, but it became the source of debate with his followers and with others. John says all the right things here. He says all the right things about himself and about Jesus, so Jesus just leaves that alone in order for that just to kind of take root. Because the sole object of concern is really verse 36. He who believes in the Son has eternal life, but he who does not obey the Son will not see life, but the wrath of God abides on him. And notice again, this is almost kind of a repeat of John 3:16. This is in John the Gospel writer from John the Baptist. This is just a repeat of what Jesus has said in verse 16. And notice here we've got that powerful, encouraging statement that if you believe in the Son, you have eternal life. But notice the tragedy, because if you don't, you'll be separated from him. You will bear God's wrath for eternity in hell. With my friend John Waibenga, I respected him. And I was in no frame of mind to risk any of that. But at one point at the end of the conversation, I had to tell him, you know, John, I realize that this letter is not up to your high standards of quality. But it's also not that bad. It's not that inaccurate. It's not that poorly written. And for right now, I'm simply not going to obsess over this. Now, I don't think I used the word obsess because that's kind of too confrontational. I don't remember what word I used, but I'm using it here for our sake. I wasn't going to obsess over this because I would lose sight of things that are more important. And you know when I told him that? We never talked about it again. Never came into my office again. I don't mean in a negative way, but I never had him come into my office in a negative frame of mind like that ever again. Now, I don't think he agreed with me, but he just left it alone. And you know why he left it alone? He left it alone to go out and to pursue other opportunities in Samaria. Meaning John just basically did what John always did, is he went out and he ministered in another place in the church. I knew, as a young, overmatched pastor at that time, that I had to maintain my own balanced concern about my role in communicating truth. And the fact is, I never do it perfectly. Dr. Norman Geisler, he's one of those three guys I've mentioned in the past who I had one of my marveling experiences with. You know, the jaw drops, the eyes pop open. Dr. Norman Geisler once said, I've heard him say this many times, that God's word is infallible, but my understanding of it is not. The time that I heard that, you know, I was in one of those marveling states. And I've repeated that to myself many times. And in fact, I've even added to it. I think it was so good I even added to it. I have said that God's word is infallible, but sometimes my communicating of it is not. Sometimes I just don't get it all right. So it's imperative that I stay as true as possible to all the rules that are surrounding translation and exposition. It's the same kind of thing you and I have to do all the time. Every time you go to your job and there's instructions, you have to stay true to the rules of translation and exposition. If you want to put together your kid's tricycle at Christmas time, you have to stay true to the rules of exposition and translation, because as a dad, I've tried not to many times and I end up with 6 extra parts. You have to stay true to the rules that are given on the back of a chocolate chip recipe to get the cookies right. Rules like context. Rules like perspicuity, meaning words have meaning to them. Allow the author to say what he has to say. Rules about the intent of the author. The main things are the plain things, and the plain things are the main things. And there are other rules as well. Because this keeps truth clear, organized, intelligible, understandable, and most of all, relevant to the person that you're talking to. I don't want pettiness of issues to remove the source of knowledge and truth, which is Jesus and His Word. And any issue can and should be addressed. You can talk about anything in the spiritual life or life as a whole as the circumstances so unfold, but not if Jesus and His Word are pushed aside. You know, I find myself in all kinds of discussions with people on all kinds of topics. Now, if anybody would have said this to me when I was sitting in that truck with my Uncle George, or any time up until my early 20s, that I was going to be someone up in public, I would have said, you're absolutely out of your mind. I was a back-of-the-class type of kid. I was a follower, not a leader, and I was perfectly happy with that. But God just had other plans. So since then, I have found myself in all kinds of discussions about marriage, about modern, questions of human sexuality, about abortion, about climate change, about, yes, Jeremy, you're going to be happy, about gun control. I'm a Second Amendment advocate, even though you're probably more of an expert than I am. But I found myself in discussions about that. I found myself in plenty of discussions about UFOs. Can you imagine that? I never would have dreamed that. Politics, of course, God's existence, crime and punishment, veganism, creation, evolution, and the list goes on and on and on. And I have to be careful not to get lost in the debate without first being sure that somehow the discussion either begins or ends or both with Jesus and His Word and His place, and how all of these things work and have their being. Let's stand.